On the top right-hand corner, you are able to download our PowerPoint presentation at any time during the webinar. Below is the evaluation link. We'd greatly appreciate if you could take 5 minutes to complete this after the webinar. Please help us ensure we're providing high-quality training and technical assistance by completing this short evaluation. In the Q&A box, please feel free to ask your questions to our presenters. In the bottom right-hand corner, feel free to participate in conversation with everyone else. I hope you enjoy this webinar. Wendy?
Hi, Jessica. Thank you very much. This is Wendy Quarles, and I am the director of the YTAC project. And I want to welcome, we had 198 people register for today, and I see that the participants are rolling in as we speak. We have a broad variety of people who've joined this part one in our three-part series, ranging from folks that work in the VR system formally, and schools and correctional facilities. We have job coaches, we have benefits planners, we have family members. So I love the fact of the broad background that comes to the table today, and we look forward to hearing from you in the Q&A or chat boxes about questions you may have on this topic area. I'll talk about our speakers in a little bit, but I do welcome Thomas Golden and Jim Sheldon today to the webinar. And I apologize for my voice. I'm losing my voice just a little bit. I want to tell you a little bit about the YTAC before we get started today. We are funded by the Rehab Services Administration, and we are the Youth Technical Assistance Center, and we are led and housed at the Institute for Educational Leadership's Center for Workforce Development. We have great partnerships at the YTAC. We work with Cornell University's K. Lisa Yang and Hock E. Tan Institute on Employment and Disability in the School of Industrial and Labor Relations. We have an evaluation relationship with Boston University School of Education. And then we have this amazing group of key subject matter experts from across the country. You'll hear from Jim Sheldon is one of our key subject matter experts today. On the webinar, and we have many more that bring their talent to our partnership. A little bit about IEL. The Institute for Educational Leadership is located in Washington, D.C., and you can read on the slide here that they spend their time teaching and encouraging leaders to take a look at institutional boundaries and to work across them, to increase knowledge and expand networks focusing on topics related to education, youth, and parent engagement. The three topics that IEL spends a lot of time focusing on are equity and impact, leadership and engagement, and the subjects of transition, disability, employment. I highly encourage you to go to the website listed below or give us a call at IEL. I think you'll see a myriad of resources available on the website pertaining to the topic areas listed under the bullets. The YTAC in its charge is expected to provide training and technical assistance to state VR agencies across the country. There's 80 VR agencies across this broad country that we live in, and we are specifically charged with helping youth with disabilities find, helping VR systems, to find and engage youth with disabilities who are not specifically in special education, and also to work with out-of-school youth. We specifically focus on youth who are experiencing homelessness, involved in foster care, or the juvenile justice systems. So you can imagine the topic that we're going to talk about today has special meaning and great impact in the group that we've just described here. Today's topics and the topics that will be discussed going on will be also featured in what we call policy briefs. You'll receive a copy of the policy brief within the next couple weeks, so any persons that participated in the webinar will receive that directly, as well as the briefs, the copies of this webinar, archived versions of webinars, and ongoing tools pertaining to this webinar series will be featured on the YTAC website. which link is listed below there. We are part of a network of youth technical assistance centers across the country, and I've just put a few up here. We all focus in various ways and very target areas to ensure that all students and youth have the preparation and support that they need to pursue and maintain employment. So you'll see in the tools that we create, the educational opportunities we deliver, and the work we do along with our sister tax centers that we're always focusing on helping youth and students to secure employment and giving you the capacity and talent and tools to do that. Jessica, a few minutes ago mentioned, and if you've been part of any technical assistance or training receiving, you know that we are expected to conduct evaluation. So I think she mentioned just briefly that at the end of the webinar, we do appreciate your feedback. As the director of the YTAC who works across the country, we're waiting to hear from you what other topics you need to learn in order to do your jobs better. So do take a few minutes to let us know how we did today and how you'd like to see us do in the future in terms of bringing information to you. If you have a question about certificates and CRC credit, right up until yesterday we were working with our partner who provides CRC credits, and they assured us that we will be able to get you CRC certification after the fact of the webinar today and then prior to the webinars moving forward. So if you are in need of CRC verification for attending today, we'll need you to complete an evaluation and then let us know that you need a CRC verification form, and we will send that out to you. We have 3 webinars in this series, so today is the first one, and we have 2 more coming up in the next couple of weeks. On Tuesday, coming up December 4th, we will be talking about providing benefits and work incentive planning supports just in time, with quotes around that. We're very excited about that webinar to introduce a desk reference tool to you that we have developed for your expertise. And then on Friday, December 14th, we're pulling together an amazing group of experts in the field, and you can see by that speakers list, who will bring you information that we've learned from the field, lessons from state promise projects, what they've learned about the subject that we'll be talking about throughout the webinar series. And without further ado, and so that you don't need to hear my scratchy voice anymore, I am pleased to welcome my 2 colleagues, Thomas Golden, who is the Executive Director at Cornell University at the K. Lisa Yang and Hockey Tan Institute, and Jim Sheldon, who's currently the Supervising Attorney at Neighborhood Legal Services out of Buffalo, New York. The 2 of them bring an amazing amount of expertise on this topic area to the group today, and we look forward to hearing from them and the excellent information that they will bring to us. So Thomas and Jim, I'll pass it over to you.
Wendy, thank you so much for the introduction, and Jessica for your support in helping to produce today's broadcast. I want to start off by just sharing with you that we will be covering and dealing with, of course, content that uses a lot of abbreviations. And so Jim and I thought it'd be a good idea to start out kind of bringing you up to speed on what some of those abbreviations are that you might commonly hear when you hear folks talking about benefits and work incentives planning. One being PASS, that being the Plan to Achieve Self-Support, SSI, which we've already used in today's broadcast, Supplemental Security Income, SSDI, Social Security Disability Insurance, WIOA, which is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act of 2014, WIPA or WIPA, which is the SSA-sponsored Work Incentive Planning and Assistance Network, Virginia Commonwealth University, we will refer to as VCU. We may use VR agency. When we use the acronym VR, we are speaking about the state vocational rehabilitation agencies that are part of the state and federal partnership which is implemented under the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 is amended. And then finally, we may use the term YTI. That refers to my institute at Cornell University. Now, we're going to cover a pretty broad spectrum today of information. And today we want to focus on helping folks understand what we mean when we talk about benefits planning services and support, why they are so important to those beneficiaries who receive either SSDI and or SSI, and why getting the service, it appears, leads to better employment outcomes. There has been a lot of research that has been done over the past 2 decades that have looked at the impact of these services on employment outcomes, and we do see positive effect. And then we're going to take a look at how state voc rehab agencies are using or can use benefits planning services. The brief that Wendy had highlighted a little bit earlier that we are going to be getting out to all of you in probably the next month actually highlights some really innovative things that some state voc rehab agencies are doing to make sure that their beneficiaries that they serve have access to high quality and high fidelity benefits planning and assistance services. And really the importance of that is to really support those beneficiaries who get SSI and DI in addressing many of the fears that they have about losing cash benefits and their health insurance, and how to use some of those real critical work incentives as they begin to explore making decisions about work, entering the workforce, and or advancing in the workplace. We're going to talk about other terms that you might hear out there in the field in practice that are similar to benefits planning and help differentiate between those, as well as define the scope of what we mean by benefits planning and what some key elements are of quality benefits planning programs or networks that might exist in your state. So we have a lot of content to cover, and we're hoping that today, as a result of our time together, that if you are in a state that already offers through the State Voc Rehab Agency these types of services, that you'll be looking at some of these quality indicators that we're going to be talking about to ensure those elements are there, and or if you're a state that does not have kind of a comprehensive approach yet to implementing and providing these services consistently across the beneficiaries that you serve, that will lay out some effective models in other state voc rehab agencies that are out there doing some really good work in this area. So just a few ground rules for us before we kind of jump into our content. Want to remind you that throughout today's broadcast that you're able to use the Q&A box and post your questions there in the chat box. There'll be certain points over time that I'll be monitoring while Jim's talking. Jim will be monitoring while I'm talking, and we will take those questions as they come in, unless, of course, we know that we're going to be covering that content in a minute or two, and we'll just wait for it to naturally unfold as part of the presentation. If you didn't get a chance to get your questions in today, again, want to remind you to send your questions to us by email, sending those to vry-tac@iel.org, and we will get back to you with a response to those questions if you don't have time for them today. But let's start off talking about the federal authority for benefits planning. For any of you that have been around for a while, working in the area of disability and employment, you know that benefits planning is not new. Benefits planning, I would say, we began to see the emergence of it as a field in the mid-'80s, early to mid-'80s, with the emergence of supported employment. And what we learned is as we began to identify new approaches and innovations to support the employment outcomes of people with the most severe disabilities, many of those individuals were recipients of benefits. And so it behooved us in the early days of supported employment to figure out what are these benefits and how are they actually impacted by employment. Now, back in the day, in those early days, you know, what we found is that there weren't many dedicated benefits planners. These are people that dedicated their time exclusively to providing these services Typically, they were job coaches or placement specialists who knew that the consumers that they worked with needed access to this information, and so they provided that as part of their job. But over time, we began to see the field, if you will, of benefits and work incentive planning begin to solidify, and a much more dedicated approach to ensuring that this critical employment support was going to be available to beneficiaries. Interestingly enough, though, prior to the passage of WIOA, WIOA in 2014, benefits planning was not mentioned in the Rehabilitation Act or the regulations that flowed from the Rehabilitation Services Administration. Those regulations historically listed many categories of services that were available to individuals that were eligible for state vocational rehabilitation services. And as long as those services appeared in the individual's Individualized Plan for Employment, or IPE, the state VR agency would pay for it, unless, of course, there was another source of payment. And so prior to the passage of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, many VR agencies funded benefits planning, although apparently typically did that as other goods and services determined necessary to achieve an employment outcome. And we provide you that Code of Federal Regulations citation there. And benefits planning typically was funded underneath that opportunity. But with the passage of the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act of 2014, the Federal Rehab Act was amended, and it, as you know, Title I authorizes that funding for state voc rehab agencies. But in addition, it also authorized benefits planning as an available service, specifically when serving SSDI or SSI disability beneficiaries. The agency shall provide general information on additional supports and assistance for individuals with disabilities desiring to enter the workforce, including assistance with benefits planning. Now, what's interesting about that is that, even though that might be the first time that we see benefits planning officially being cited in the Rehabilitation Act, prior to that, with the passage of the Ticket to Work and Work Incentive Improvement Act of 1999, a national network or an external core of work incentive specialists were authorized under that piece of legislation, but they operated outside of the state vocational rehabilitation program, even though some of those early benefits planning, assistance, and outreach programs were actually housed within state voc rehab programs. That service was not authorized under the Rehab Act. It was authorized under the Ticket to Work and Work Incentives Improvement Act. So, Jessica, let's issue that first poll that we have there. Throughout today's broadcast, we're going to be polling you just to kind of gauge the level of knowledge and where you are with some of the content that we're presenting. And so, Jessica, if you could pull up the first poll for us. Thank you. And if you're able to expand that screen for us so that we can read it.
And Thomas, if you'll excuse me for a minute, this is Wendy.
Please, Wendy,
I'm having
go ahead.
I have a couple people talking about the audio breaking up. And Jessica, I'm not sure if that is something we can address before we move forward. It says it's cracking in and out.
Hi, I'll look into it right now, okay?
Okay.
Thank you, Jessica.
For folks that are having difficulties hearing us, she will be getting technical assistance. So we are doing full captioning, which is capturing the words that Thomas is saying, and hopefully you can hear him all the way through. So thank you, Thomas.
Thank you, Wendy, so much. And so I want to read the first poll for us here and have you respond to it. Benefits planning includes all except which one of the following goals? A, to provide a beneficiary individualized information about the impact of earnings on their benefits. B, to provide beneficiary-specific information about work incentives, or C, to help people maximize their benefits. Benefits planning includes all except which one of the following. And as you can see on the screen here, it's almost unanimous that folks are saying it is not a goal of benefits planning to help people maximize their benefits. And thank you, Jessica, for putting that up, because that is the correct answer. While I think as we saw the field of benefits planning begin to emerge, it really was about ensuring the rights of people with disabilities and that benefits that they were entitled to, they would not learn. And I think in those early days, as one of those placement people myself who learned about benefits planning and was working with individuals in the early 80s and mid-80s, you know, some of our best advice back then was to be cautious and to not lose your benefits, but maintain your benefits while still working. And so I think that benefits maximization, while originally it may have been something that was a priority for us and a principle that we held to in the field, over the last, I would say, 25 years, we've seen pretty drastic movement away from that, and not wanting to support the underemployment of people, but rather to help them recognize full employment based on their abilities, their interests, and their preferences. Now, there's a lot of different terminology that's used to describe the service. You'll hear terms like benefits planning, benefits counseling, benefits advisement, work incentive counseling, all really relating to the same thing. And, you know, what I think is helpful is to understand, so what do we mean, you know, regardless of the nomenclature that we use to title it, you know, what are those cornerstones of what the service is? And so VCU, in their capacity as a national training center, you know, identified several different pieces that they thought were critical cornerstones of work incentive planning and assistance services. And that includes in-depth personalized benefits analysis covering federal, state, and local benefits, customized counseling about the effective work on all the benefits and entitlements that an individual might receive, including development of a comprehensive benefit summary and analysis, as well as assistance with identifying, developing, and using and managing their work incentives, helping to aid in problem solving, helping to resolve barriers that they might be experiencing on their way to employment. In addition, there was kind of a seminal a piece of work done back in 2000 by Golden, Farrell, O'Mara, and Sheldon that defined benefits and work incentive planning assistance as a set of benefits and work incentive counseling strategies, services, and support that seek to promote work preparation, attachment, and advancement, focusing on the enhancement of self-sufficiency and independence of individuals with disabilities who receive disability benefits and other entitlements through informed choice, which may result in decreased reliance on public benefit programs and increased financial well-being. One of the most critical parts of that definition being the which may result in. It doesn't say it is going to result in it, because when we talk about informed choice, that's an individualized experience. And even though I might have the same type of disability, I might have the same package or portfolio of benefits, one individual is not going to make the same decision as somebody else about whether they're going to jump in the deep end of the employment pool or they're going to take a more gradual, dip your toe in, try it out, and more gradually increase the ability, if you will, in the workplace. And so it's important to understand when we talk about benefits, that's what we're talking. And VR agencies may use different terminology. You might even have different systems that use different terminology. ELASA is a great example because they authorize financial and work incentives counseling at one level and benefits analysis in counseling for a later level, right? So ELASA is tiered. What's important is to understand that regardless of what the nomenclature is, what kind of the cornerstones, if you will, or what the scope of the benefits are actually going to be providing. Jessica, can you hit us with that second poll in mind? And this is kind of a follow-up in regard to us talking about the passage of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act of 2014, and if you could expand that window. Thank you so much. The second poll being prior to WIOA, benefits planning was not specifically authorized in federal law under Title IV of the Workforce Investment Act. Is that true or false? True. Number one, false is number two. And people jumped right out of the gate on that one, Wendy and Jim. I think are listening, they're pretty knowledgeable about your services in state location rehabilitation. Yeah, thank you, Jessica. That is absolutely true. Prior to that, but keep in mind, benefits planning was authorized. We have a long, rich history in the U.S. of different initiatives and research initiatives that have been funded by the Social Security Administration, the U.S. Department of Labor, the Rehab Services Administration, from state partnership initiatives to work incentive grants to the Medicaid infrastructure grants, and the 1 for 2 offset, the bond project, and now we have Promise. All of those had benefits planning and assistance as a critical element of that. And the forerunner to all of those, of course, being Project Network. So let's talk, before I turn this over to Jim, real quickly, just about what the scope of benefits planning services includes. And so I talked about some of the Social Security-sponsored efforts that they had taken part in over the last 3-4 decades. Currently, we have the Work Incentive Planning and Assistance Network, which is actually authorized under the Ticket to Work and Work Incentives Improvement Act. And the scope of services for the WIPA are dictated by federal grants with training through the WIPA National Training and Data Center that's located at Virginia Commonwealth University. And they identify several key services. First, in-depth personalized benefits analysis that covers all different federal, state, and local benefits and entitlements that somebody might be eligible for. Customized counseling about the effective work on their benefits and development of a comprehensive benefits summary and analysis report. And then finally, ongoing assistance with identifying, developing, utilizing, and managing any work incentives that the beneficiary might choose to begin to utilize as they make their path toward employment. Now, there's been also a lot
Thomas, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. We are clearly having some problems with the audio. The captioner is saying they're not hearing directly. I don't know if something's going on with your phone on your end. And I apologize, folks. We're looking to enhance the audio capacity, particularly moving forward. But Thomas, people are saying that they can't hear.
Yeah, and Wendy, I'm not for sure what's going on. I've got great connectivity on my phone. Am I maybe talking too fast?
No, it's better. It's better right. Yeah, it's better right now. So something you just did to talk directly in was coming more directly. So
okay.
I'll watch for the captioner, and the captioner saying he is the only one I can't hear. So we'll do our best to have people hear you, and we'll also, if the captioner has questions, and thank you, folks. We'll be switching over to Jim in a few minutes, and let us know if that's causing problems too.
Well, I think probably at this juncture, Jim, I'm going to turn it to you. I would prefer that folks be able to actually hear the content, and I'm going to be shifting after this slide to you anyway. So do you mind taking over a little bit early to make sure people can get this?
Not at all, Thomas. And what I'll do, because I think we're okay on time, let me just go back to slide 18. Again, Jim Sheldon, and I'll try to peek at the chat box to see if people are hearing me okay. And I just want to reiterate, since I'm not seeing anything yet in the Q&A box, but I think we're going to be getting more into the substance of things, certainly feel free to jump into that Q&A box with your questions and Thomas will be watching it while I'm talking, and we'll try to cover as many of those questions as possible. I think the chat box up till now has been kind of filled with people's frustration, and we're sorry for that about the hearing. So back to the slide 18, where I think Thomas was cutting in and out. The Social Security funded project, the WIPA project, and my office oversees one of these projects. This is probably, certainly the biggest of the funded projects. There's a WIPA project in every state, and some states have multiple projects, but by no means is it the only source of benefits planning. But what you'll see on the screen is for WIPA, the scope of services is pretty much defined in grant conditions, and those key services are identified in Virginia Commonwealth University's WIPA training manual. And as Thomas was relaying to you, though not coming through all that well, in-depth, personalized benefits analysis covering all federal, state, and local benefits, customized counseling about the effect of work on benefits, development of a benefits summary and analysis, or those in the field just call it the BSNA, and then assistance with identifying, utilizing, and managing work incentives. If you look at the next screen, Cornell, in its training manual, doesn't dictate how trainees deliver services because it's not funded by any particular grant. But they identify some potential benefits planning practice domains, including benefits screening, benefits advisement, benefits management, kind of a tiered system. And we cover this stuff in a bit more detail. It's kind of a theoretical approach to this. We cover it in more detail in the policy brief. So as I transition into this next section, which on VR agency benefits planning fee-for-service examples, Jessica, I wonder if you could bring up the next poll. Okay. So fee-for-service models are used most frequently by state VR agencies to fund benefits planners. True or false? And this seems to be, as this is rolling out, kind of a much closer vote. What I can tell you as we look at the screen and see it's about 75-25 now, that historically, and I have to admit we don't have firm data on this, but it's pretty clear that the fee-for-service model is what's been used most frequently. But we're going to be talking about some other models as well, and some other models that are working quite successfully. So I'll see if looks like we're getting pretty much through that poll. So thank you, Jessica. It looks like it's about 77-22, and true is the correct answer. So before I go into this section of the slides, I just want to make some initial comments. Going forward, benefits planning, as Thomas laid out for you, is now officially a service as authorized in the WIOA of 2014 and spelled out in the regulations of 2016. And we'll use the term benefits planning more than anything else in this presentation because that's the term that's used in the Vocational Rehabilitation Act and the RSA regulations. Now we know that many of the state VR agencies started funding benefits planning services well before 2014, and in fact, I was involved in a presentation with people from Alaska and Maryland, probably back a dozen years ago, about state VR agencies funding benefits planning service. So certainly by then, it was already established in a number of states. So let me start with Alaska first. And Thomas already shared with you these two titles. I'll refer to them as Level 1 and Level 2 benefits planning. Those are my terms, not theirs. Financial and work incentive advisement. It assesses basic financial and the benefit situation related to work, provides basic information about work incentive possibilities and financial planning, determining the need for that next level of service, which is benefits analysis and counseling. And sometimes in my office, we use the terms brief service and full service, and I'd say that the benefits analysis and counseling is kind of in that deeper full service, which generally includes completing a thorough analysis of the impact employment will have on the individual's benefits, and helps people to utilize any number of work incentives, including the past plans that we referred to before. On this next slide, we show you the representative payment rates. That first level, what I refer to as level 1, or kind of the briefer service, hourly fees of $50 to $85 are authorized. In that more intense level of benefits analysis and counseling, the fees are up just a little bit to $55 to $95, and now they authorize flat rates of $350 or $450. And in the policy brief, you'll actually see links to the longer document that explains some of this. And anyone that's ever either been to Alaska or is familiar with the geography will know that it's much more difficult for people to be service providers as you get way up north. And you'll see in this last bullet that there are higher fees authorized, 150% of those rates in the Arctic and the Aleutians. And similarly, in a state like New York, we have a little bit higher rates for the more expensive areas like New York City. Okay, Virginia. Virginia has a bit of a different program. When you go and look at the documents on their website that kind of make up the menu of what's available for private benefits planning practitioners to bill for service, they have 15 different billable service categories, and we've just outlined a few of them here. One deals with taking steps to establish eligibility for the 1619B Medicaid work incentive. A second one to work with the beneficiary to establish the right to something that they call the SSI Student Earned Income Exclusion. We'll be going through that a bit next week when we do our webinar outlining the new toolkits. Work with the beneficiary to facilitate preparation of one of these past plans, or working with them to establish blind work expenses. And again, these are just 4 of 15 different categories. So, moving on here, their payment rates, they range from $50 to $850. They use flat fees. So for 1619B, it's $200. 1619B is generally a bit easier to establish than the student earned income exclusion. Student earned income exclusion tends to be a bit of a best kept secret. A little bit more work involved, a little higher payment rate. You see a $250 payment rate for helping to establish eligibility for that state's Medicaid buy-in for working individuals. And then a higher one for establishing the right to blind work expenses, which takes a little bit more work, a pretty wide array of potential blind work expenses. Now, the last state we want to go through, and by no means are these the only states that do this. These are just representative showings of how some of the states do it. In New York, where I come from, there's vouchers available for what we call benefits advisement services. And in New York, it's pretty much the vocational rehabilitation counselor using the standard voucher form that it will send out to the agency saying, we authorize you to provide a number of hours of service for this particular individual. And we've had a working relationship with our state VR agency for about a dozen years on this. In fact, I worked with the head of the local agency here to help put together the initial criteria for starting this program some dozen years ago or so. And most of our vouchers come with some specific definitions of what they're looking for. Some are more specific than others. I should mention that in addition to what you might think of as traditional benefits planning service, we get some to provide assistance with an SSI or SSDI application. We have some expertise in that in-house. We have a person in-house with expertise in helping people overcome defaulted student loans, which can be a barrier to getting VR-related services. And occasionally, we'll get vouchers to deal with specific issues like the development of a PASS plan, and in cases like that, we're probably going to ask for more hours because a lot more involvement in putting together a PASS plan. Our payment rates in New York, you'll notice they range from $46 to $52 an hour, depending on what part of the state you're in. We don't have a flat fee structure. And when those vouchers come to providers, and again, we're one of the providers, you'll see hours authorized as low as 5. What tends to be typical is a 10-hour voucher, but again, in New York, our benefits planners or benefits advisement people can ask for more hours, and they go directly to the individual counselor for that. And Thomas, I'm not seeing anything in the Q&A line, so I'm going to keep moving, but I know you've had some impact on this through your role on New York State's Advisory Council for VR. Did you want to comment on that, and we'll see how the audio is on that? I think Thomas may have shut off his connection because he had some...
No, I'm here, Jim. I actually had muted my line.
I'm hearing you okay. So if you've got any comments on New York's fee-for-service program, go ahead and make them. Otherwise, I can move on.
No, I think that you covered it pretty well, Jim. So I would just say to move along.
Okay, sounds good. Now, got some examples of state VR agencies using their own staff to provide benefits planning. And as Thomas mentioned, there are a number of state VR agencies that have actually become WIPA providers. They get the grants from the Social Security Administration to provide direct benefits planning services. And I want to share with you 2 different examples, and I've actually communicated with Georgia and Utah about this. So let's take the Georgia VR agency first. And Georgia's VR program has its own, what I'll call, benefits planning unit. And they're putting together 2 sources of funding. They get the Social Security WIPA grant, which they use to cover 120 counties. In fact, if you go on their website, you'll see a map that shows you the counties in Georgia that they cover. And that covers the cost of 4 full-time benefits planners. And we'll talk in a bit about the importance of having people doing this work that are devoting a fairly substantial amount of time to it. And to the extent that benefits planning entities can employ people who are doing it full time, that can be tremendous. Now, in Georgia, they supplement that funding through a memorandum of understanding through the Georgia Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities. That funds an additional 4 benefits planners. So in Georgia, they've been and these are all people who are housed and employees of the state VR agency. And they're all trained through Virginia Commonwealth University, either through VCU's grant to provide the multi-day training for WIPA staffers, or VCU also has funding to provide the same training to what they call community partners. And those individuals funded by the state agency funding are considered community partners, but they all get their training and technical assistance through VCU. So that's the Georgia model. The Utah model, somewhat similar. They too have both WIPA funding and in the case of Utah, funding from their state VR agency. Utah is not as populous as Georgia, but they still manage to have 4 benefits planners. So it's great when entities can put various sources of money together. And I'll just kind of ad lib here and say that at our agency, Neighborhood Legal Services in Buffalo, we serve a 20-plus county area through our WIPA grant, but we also have funding through our state VR agency that now probably funds almost a full-time equivalent person. And the more you can kind of put these funding sources together, the better presence of expertise that you can have. And I see somebody asking a question here, Thomas. Is there a protocol you can provide to establish eligibility for 1619B? Let me go ahead and answer that. The way 1619B is supposed to work, when a person is on SSI and they go to work, I'm going to oversimplify this a little bit. When they're on SSI and they go to work, their SSI benefit gradually goes down as their wages go up. After the first $65 or $85, they lose $1 for every $2 of additional earnings. When they zero out, probably making about $1,500 or $1,600 a month gross, generally, their Medicaid can continue under 1619B criteria. It should happen automatically. But Virginia obviously has found that in some cases there needs to be some intervention from the benefits planner. And I would say that it's typically just making sure whoever does this decision making, and usually that's going to be somebody at Social Security, has properly identified somebody. But I'd be happy to go back and forth with whoever posted that question, maybe offline after this session.
Jim, we will be talking about that a little bit more in the second webinar as we talk about
Sure.
the just-in-time toolkit.
Sounds great. So the elements of a quality benefits planning program. This, I think, is extremely important. Thomas had mentioned that A lot of folks got into this area of benefits planning coming out of the supported employment model. There's a few others of us, like myself, Ray Sabula, who works at Cornell and used to work at the Disability Law Center in Boston, who came to this having done a lot of advocacy representing people denied Social Security or SSI benefits and taking those cases to hearings and eventually finding some people that were having a hard time dealing with work issues once they got on benefits. And back in those early days, in the mid and late 1980s, we didn't really have any protocols for what we were doing. We just kind of helped people as we went along in addition to other things we were doing. But with the emergence of dedicated sources of funding, I'd say these elements of a quality benefits planning program or network have emerged. So, first element, certificate-based multi-day training program is required. What's the rationale for that? Well, anybody who's worked in this area for a number of years will have some understanding of what benefits planners are called upon to understand. First, they need to understand this very complex benefit system that's SSDI, SSI, Medicare, and Medicaid. They also have to have a basic knowledge of other federal benefits like housing subsidies, food stamps, state VR program. I can tell you the first time I did a pass for somebody, I thought I did a wonderful job for this woman back in the late 80s. And the first thing that happened is the housing subsidy program wanted to count that extra income she had against her housing subsidy. And this was before the federal housing regulations had changed to accommodate that. So that can be an issue. They need to know about state-specific benefits, like that Medicaid buy-in that Virginia is willing to pay to facilitate eligibility. And most important, they've got to be able to apply that knowledge to case-specific scenarios and explain applications to the SSI and SSDI beneficiaries that they work with. This is why this multi-day training is becoming a requirement for a lot of the VR agencies that fund benefits planners. Right now, there's 2 national training programs, and I just have them in this particular order: VCU first and Cornell second, though I'm not going to say one is better than the other. VCU is the SSA, Social Security funded WIPA technical assistance and training entity, and they deliver their 5-day training to all new WIPA benefits planners. With that same program provided to community partners. Remember, Georgia has 4 of their benefits planners funded as community partners. And their certification process involves a series of online assessments plus 3 passing scores on these written benefit summary analysis reports on real cases. So it's I've seen a number of people through this. It's a very intense program to go through. Cornell does something very similar. It offers both online and in-person training that's multi-day, similar to VCU. Its certification process requires passing online assessments plus a passing score on 1 BSNA involving a real case. Now, unfortunately, Social Security does not recognize their certification for WIPA staff, but many of the state VR agencies will recognize the training and certification that Cornell provides. The give you some examples of some of the state agencies that require certification for benefits planning. In New York, when we put together that criteria, and I was fairly insistent they had something like this in it, benefits advisors, as New York calls them, have to have certification either through the VCU training or whoever's the current WIPA training provider, through Cornell, or through substantially equivalent training. If somebody's come here from another state and they've attended something that's substantially equivalent, they can probably be recognized by our state VR agency. Virginia's state VR agency says you have to have certification from either VCU or Cornell. Oregon is interesting. Oregon has its own Work Incentives Network program. It's funded by their State Department of Human Services, though I believe it's housed at the State VR agency. I, by the way, know the people that do this in both Virginia and Oregon. Certification is required either through WIN's multi-day training program in Oregon, the state program, or through VCU or Cornell. And again, these are just examples. Any number of other states are now requiring this. Annual continuing education requirements. Boy, it sounds like we're piling it on. Well, it's a recognition that this is a complicated area. Key benefits programs have ever-changing policies. I have to tell you, we have some very experienced people here, but they might be lost if they didn't have a way to keep up with the changes. The other thing is, it's hard to remember everything. You should see the thickness of the VCU or Cornell training manuals when they're printed out. There's no way, even if you've gone through the 5-day training and you've been a benefits planner for 10 years, you're going to remember every single thing if it doesn't come up that often. Refresher courses can be a wonderful thing. Continuing education is also needed to develop a better depth of expertise. What we see happening, and I've got just an example here, benefits planners need added expertise, for example, to counsel beneficiaries who are nearing retirement age. I would say if you dialed back a dozen years, very few individuals over 60 who were coming to us for services, much, much more significant number of people in their late 50s, early 60s, approaching age 65 or 66, who are on disability benefits, still working, and are trying to negotiate, do I stay on the SSDI program, do I move into early retirement, what happens when I hit retirement, full retirement age if I'm still working. And that's why continued education becomes a critical element to establishing a quality benefits planning program or network. Somebody asks here, you have to go, oh, I think it's people communicating with each other. Thomas, I'm not seeing anything in the Q&A box, so I'm going to keep going.
Yep, keep going, no questions.
Continuing education to retain VCU or Cornell certification. When we first started out with Social Security funding, it was through something called the Benefits Planning Assistance and Outreach Project in the year 2000. In 2006, they changed the name, they changed the program a little bit, and now call it the Work Incentive Planning Assistance Project. 5-day training required back in 2010, 2011, and so forth. Excuse me, 2000, 2001, 2002, up through 2006. But in those days, there was not anyone keeping track to make sure you're keeping up with developments. Can't remember exactly when they first required this, but the WIPA program staff now have to attain 18 units per year of what they call continuing certification credits. Their community partners have pretty much the same requirements if they want to retain their certification. And again, remember, VCU certification is one alternative thing that a lot of the VR agencies are requiring. Cornell requires 60 hours of Cornell approved credits for a 5-year period following the most recent certification. Somewhat less onerous, but still pretty heavy duty to make sure you're getting roughly 12 credits a year to maintain that certification. So we're recommending that as one of the elements of a quality program. Yes, sir.
Jim, it's Thomas, and I apologize. Some folks are typing into the Q&A box, but I'm not able to see it. And so I am scrolling up through the chat box, and I did find a couple questions. Do you mind taking those right now?
Sure.
Keith Borkney had asked, if someone goes through the Cornell training and then would like to work with Social Security, I'm assuming under WIPA, will they have to go through the VCU training, or is there some sort of refresher they can take?
Okay, so the question is Cornell's training and certification enough if a person wants to move over to a WIPA project? Unfortunately, correct. They're going to have to go through the VCU training. It's SSA has no process for directly recognizing Cornell. It's unfortunate.
That's
Other
great.
questions?
Thank you. No, that's great. And then Kelly had asked, this was before you got to the continuing education requirement, but you answered that just now with the presentation. And then I'm just looking down through again. It looks like we're caught up.
Okay. I'll let you peek as I've got a few more slides, and so I'm going to say keep your questions coming because we'd be happy to entertain as many of those as we can. Planners should dedicate a minimum amount of time to the work. What's the rationale for this? Well, we've been doing this a pretty long time at my office. I'd say our first project before Social Security started funding those original benefits planning assistance and outreach projects, we got involved in a demonstration project back in late 1998. And until that time, I think I mentioned, we were spending some time in this area, but we didn't have benefits planners per se. Nobody sat down with people and had an actual benefits planning case. And once we had a full-fledged Social Security funded project with full-time and part-time people, I know we came to the conclusion that if at all possible, we wanted people that were doing this at least half-time. Is that practical? Not always. But the rationale for wanting people to dedicate a minimum amount of time to the work is if you're to function in this very complex field at a high level, you need to do it more than casually. Full-time, of course, is better than part-time. Half-time is better than a few hours per week. I will mention that somebody I knew who was providing technical assistance to WIPA providers back in the early part of the program lamented that there were a few projects where they tried to have people doing this at, say, 10% time or so. And it just didn't work out very well. So a few years ago, Social Security, for its WIPA program, established a minimum standard. Now, if you're a WIPA-funded benefits planner, you have to work the equivalent of 40% of a full-time position, which is about 16 hours per week. You can get to that 40% with any combination of WIPA and what they refer to as WIPA-like work. So I know in our project, we'll have people who meet that 40%, generally a little bit higher than that, through some combination of WIPA funding and funding through our state VR fee-for-service program. But I applaud this requirement, and it's certainly something people should think about if they're trying to make sure that what they have is a quality benefits planning program or network of providers. Quality technical assistance for benefits planners. Why? What's the rationale here? Well, a lot of the folks out there doing this have limited experience. There's going to be turnover, just as there is in any field. I know if people are working in agencies, perhaps where they're the only ones doing it, or maybe there's only a couple of people doing it, if they don't have an experienced mentor available to them, they need somebody they can go to discuss complicated issues. And we would urge that a quality technical assistance provider preferably has at least 10 years experience doing some combination of things like being a benefits planner supervisor, so that they're able to take calls and emails from people around the country. I'm jumping ahead of myself, to people at least who are doing benefits planning in the region that they serve. Two models I'll present at the national level, and then I'll give you a couple of examples of what's happening in a couple states. Back to VCU and Cornell. VCU, through their Social Security funding, currently has 7 staff to serve Social Security's 10 multi-state regions. So I know Ray from Cornell, in addition to doing the Cornell technical assistance, is also working through VCU to serve the New England states. Somebody else from VCU is serving New York and a few other states. And so they cover the whole country through 7 different staff. And pretty much their TA is available on demand. I'd say more than anything, it's through email these days, and the same thing, I think, through Cornell. Cornell has 3 staff to serve all those nationwide who have obtained their certification through Cornell and have maintained that certification. And their technical assistance, like VCU's, is also available on demand, again, primarily through email, but I know people at VCU and Cornell will get on the phone, often for great amounts of time, to provide technical assistance. I'll let you decide if there's questions in there, Thomas. I'm not going to try to read them as I'm presenting. A couple of in-state examples, and I kind of alluded to this a little bit before. Oregon and Virginia. In the state of Oregon, their work incentive network employs 2 full-time technical assistance specialists to service all those who are doing benefits planning in their statewide WIN network. Most of the funding for those benefits planners is coming through state sources. I'd have to look back on my materials to see to what extent this is VR funding, to what extent it might come through another agency. But these 2 people, and I know one of them personally, who just recently moved to a different job, extremely experienced folks doing the technical assistance in their state. Virginia Work Incentive Specialist Network, a fellow by the name of Mike Klinger, who used to work for our project until about 10 years ago, is the primary technical assistant specialist available to all those who are in their statewide WISA network. Does that mean people in that network cannot call on VCU if they went through their training as a community partner? No, but one advantage of having somebody within your very state who you're relying on for technical assistance is they're going to be much more familiar with the way a lot of things play out at the local level, particularly with something like Medicaid. So,
Jim, I had a
Yes,
question
sir.
come in from Kathleen Johnson, and she
Okay.
would like your advice. She's asking, would you say that the 16-hour rule that you had talked about under the WIPA program, should that
Yep.
be the standard to set for new staff members that are being hired with the expectation of performing this benefits plan in addition to other job duties?
I'll give you my opinion. I think that is a good benchmark for the amount of time a person needs to put into this highly complex area to be able to fully wrap your arms around it. Is there something magical about 16 hours where 12 hours wouldn't be enough? It may depend on the staff, but in my experience, and I've seen a lot of people go from ground zero to experience, it's much harder to do it if your time dedicated isn't beginning to approach a half-time position. So yes, I'd certainly recommend that, having dealt with this firsthand.
That's great, Jim. I have another question from Barbara Wegner. Can the training be implemented in a prison setting?
Can the training be implemented in the prison setting? Boy, when you just thought you heard all the questions, and I'm going to assume you would be thinking about having a prisoner be trained to provide this service. And I'm going to assume for the purpose of this discussion that you're probably talking about somebody who is approaching a release date, and maybe this is a transition into the community for them where this is what they're going to do. I don't know how practical that is.
Yeah,
I might.
Jim, she actually followed up and said it would be for a staff to be trained.
Oh, staff at the prison. I'd love to have maybe a conversation with this person to find out exactly what they're thinking about. I mean, most prisoners eventually are going to get, I know we certainly have people on our caseload who have only been out of prison for a short time. They come out, they're back on benefits, they want to work. I think it would be at least worth exploring. I doubt that SSA would authorize VCU to include prison staff in their community partner training, but I think it's worth exploring. So I would suggest this person, feel free to reach out to either of us, and maybe we could put you in contact with somebody from VCU or Cornell to see if somebody working on a prison staff could take advantage of the training. Now, Cornell's is available online. VCU's is all in-person 5-day training. So I don't know that would in any way preclude
Right.
what prisons
Well,
do.
and Jim, I think it's important to clarify because I am seeing some questions around the difference between the VCU training and the Cornell-based training, and people saying, well, SSA doesn't recognize that, what are the implications for us? Again, it isn't an implication for anyone other than a WIPA sponsored program by SSA, because keep in mind, SSA, under the Ticket to Work Act, actually created and sponsored the national network of WIPA programs, and so they're able to layer on top of them their specific training requirements. And so it only impacts those programs that are WIPA in meeting the criteria that's established in their contract with SSA. You know, that said, probably important to point out that Cornell also was, when BPAO, the Benefits Planning Assistance and Outreach Networks, were established, Cornell University was actually the contractor by SSA to create the national curriculum. And so, you know, there's a lot of incestuousness, if you will, that occurs on a training level across the board, but it doesn't impact the State Voc Rehab Agency, only if that State Voc Rehab Agency is actually contracted with SSA as a WIPA program. So I just wanted to provide that clarification, Jim, because we had a couple questions come up about that.
Okay, thanks. And let me make a general go ahead.
Well, this is Wendy, and I just wanted to jump in and say and thank a couple people who've typed in. Beth Grube from Minnesota talked about, and I need to go back and see what she wrote, talked about the fact that the benefit planners work with the relief staff in the prison, that they send benefit planners in. And then Kelly Land from Indiana talked about the fact that they have a wonderful benefits counseling program funded in partnership with the USAID VR and the WIPA project there. So we'll make sure we capture some of those great examples that people are providing, and making sure that we can connect one another to best practices that are happening throughout the country. So thank you for your comment.
And to those Jim, there are just a couple individuals that were asking where they could get more information about certification. The policy brief that we're going to be actually sending out to you includes much more in-depth information than, of course, we're able to cover in today's webinar. So stay tuned, Brian, and those that have asked questions about that, and you'll be getting that from us in the future. Sorry, Jim, go ahead.
That's okay. And I mean, basically, we're already at the end of the content, so we're in the general Q&A, and I just want to make sure I turn it over to Wendy with about 5 minutes remaining so that she can get through the kind of closing remarks. Both Thomas and I have been active for the last 10 years or so in a national organization called the National Association of Benefits and Work Incentive Specialists. And what I can tell you from being involved in NABWIS is that the real growth in terms of the number of benefits planners out there has come outside the WIPA programs. The unfortunate thing is those of us who are WIPA grantees know we haven't seen an increase in the funding since WIPAs were first funded in late 2000. And you're clearly seeing, you know, today we're talking about VR agencies, but there's any number of entities out there that get their funding from a wide variety of sources. And so whether it's through Cornell or through VCU as a state partner, you're seeing a growth area outside the WIPA projects. And I should just mention, because I don't necessarily have a dog in this fight or a horse in this race, so to speak, both VCU and Cornell do an excellent job. I know most of the VCU trainers. I know the people at Cornell that do the training. You can't go wrong with either one. So, you know, other people may have their own opinions, but and I have to tell you, the folks in Oregon, I'm sure, do a great job at the state level. They're not mentioned during the training or in the policy brief, but I know people in Wisconsin do in-state training. Maryland's done a lot of their own training over the years, so lots of great models out there that we just don't have time to fully cover. So I've got about 3:20. Thomas, are there any other questions? I keep seeing people typing.
Yeah, no, there's some just great banter going back and forth, but no other questions came in. But also want to just, again, remind folks that this policy and practice brief that today's webinar is based on is going to be made available to you in the next few weeks. And so stay tuned to your inboxes, and you'll be getting a copy of that. And encourage you, should you have additional follow-up questions about some of the models, or we can help put you in touch with some of those states that have long-established programs, we're happy to do that. You'll be hearing more about some of those programs, for example, in the next webinar when we talk about the Just-in-Time Toolkit. We worked with the good folks at Virginia Voc Rehab and their WISA network to actually capture some video vignettes that are scattered throughout that tool, but we'll talk about that more during our next webinar. So, Wendy, we're going to turn it back to you. Oh, wait, one question came in from Andrew. So, Jim, do all states have to contact the Ticket to Work helpline in order to connect to the WIPA, whether it's the VR agency or a community partner?
The answer is no. The Ticket to Work hotline is a hotline established where people who are on Social Security or SSI can call for information. I would say as a WIPA project, 90% of our referrals now come through people that contact that hotline. But anyone can go on the Social Security website, do a search for WIPA projects, find the WIPA project in their region, and reach out to them. So you don't have to go through that hotline.
Thank you, Jim. Wendy, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay. And just by way of generalized housekeeping, we provided a slide at the end of the slide deck to send us questions that you might have or any information that you might want from the YTAC. So you see both our email address and our website address. And again, I'll reiterate that you'll be receiving an email from Jessica in the next 2 days that will ask for you to complete the webinar evaluation. That's a great mechanism for you to tell us, hey, I want to learn more on this topic or any other topics that we're talking about. I think the banter and the questions and the comments and the scope of people participating in the webinar, continue to validate that bringing this topic and this discussion to this field is an important one. So we're terribly excited to have you join us on December 4th, which is next Tuesday, I believe, for the webinar to introduce the toolkit. I think between the brief and the toolkit, you'll have many tools and products in your hand to answer a lot of the questions that are coming up in the question and answer box. So we look forward to hearing from you through the evaluation process, and we look forward to talking to you next time. That's just our disclaimer slide at the end of our webinars, and we thank you for joining us today and hope that you have a good evening, and we will talk to you next week.